I will convene our meeting of the Burlington Planning Commission for Tuesday, October 13th, 2020. Once again, we are doing this remotely. First item on our agenda is the agenda. And I understand there are a couple changes. Megan, David?
We do have one change to the agenda to introduce an additional item, which is to add, if you'll entertain it, an item to reapprove the municipal bylaw amendment report for an amendment that you have previously forwarded on to the council.
All right, let's add that on to right after item 7. So it will be item 7A.
Sounds good.
Okay, any other changes to the agenda? Then that will be our agenda as amended. Next item is the chair's report, of which there really isn't one tonight, other than welcome to everybody again for another version of an online remote meeting. David, next is director's report.
Yeah, not a whole lot new to report, you know, that continue to do a fair amount of COVID related work. But we're also working on some zoning amendments. I'm working on an update to the form-based code to provide some clarifications to a lot of questions that have kind of come up over the course of the last now almost 2 years since it's been in effect. So working on having something to get to you to begin talking about in the course of the next month or so.
Okay, good. Next item is our public forum. Opportunity for anybody who might be here joining us to speak to us. Is there anyone, Emily? Okay, doesn't look like we have anyone for public forum, so we'll move on to item 5, which is public hearing, CDO amendment ZA-21-01, daycare and preschool in RCO districts. Who's going to introduce this? Scott, are you here for that? Hey, Scott.
I'm here, but I think Megan's got this covered.
Okay,
Yeah,
Megan?
I can cover this. So you heard us introduce this proposed amendment a few weeks ago. This originally came from a request from the Winooski Valley Parks District on behalf of Forest Preschool, who was experiencing a barrier in the ordinance to enable them to expand their preschool capacity out at the Ethan Allen Homestead to address both the emergency COVID demand for preschool spaces given the altered schedule for schools this year, as well as to make some expansions to their existing footprint of the preschool. So this amendment makes some changes to the definitions of preschool and daycare facilities, namely to eliminate the distinction between small and large facilities of each kind. We had previously made a distinction between small and large, with small capped at, I think it was 20 children in a program. The limits on how many children can be in a program are set by the state licensing for these types of facilities. And we have proposed as part of this amendment that we treat all preschool and daycare facilities the same regardless of the size, that we allow the state licensing and other provisions of our ordinance to evaluate the impact based on the size of the facility. So the proposal here is to, again, eliminate those distinctions, to limit our ordinance to just defining daycare and preschool, and then to make the standards that are in our ordinance consistent with the standards that were already in our ordinance for large facilities of both kinds. So the main impact here is in the RCO districts and in the enterprise ag district, where facilities that are larger than 20 today would not be permitted. So going forward, they would be a conditional use in these districts.
Thank you. Any questions before we go to the public hearing part? All right, then let's open this up for the public hearing. Megan, is there anyone who wants to speak to us on this item?
I don't see anybody, Andy.
Okay. Then I'll close the public hearing and bring it back to the commission. Any questions, comments, or is there a motion to refer to council with the bylaw amendment report? Anyone?
Motion to refer it to council with the attached report.
Okay, motion by Emily, seconded by, who would like to second it? By Jennifer. Any more discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion, say aye.
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 Any opposed? That was unanimous. So that goes on to council. Next item is item 6, public hearing CDO amendment ZA-21-02 temporary tents. So who's introduced? Megan, is this you again?
Yeah, I'll do this one also, Andy. Similar to the last discussion, this amendment originated from staff in evaluating potential impacts of the COVID response and potential barriers in our ordinance. So we had talked before about the fact that many schools, churches, daycares, other businesses and facilities in the city are trying to utilize outdoor space to the greatest extent possible to have a more safe environment to operate in. And particularly as we move into colder months, this will become an even more important resource for people. So this amendment is seeking to extend the temporary provision for tents that are non-residential in nature to be able to be placed on private property for up to 180 days without needing a zoning permit. Currently, they would be limited to the standards that we have in our ordinance that would limit them to 10 days or 30 days within a year. So this is extending that period of when they would be exempt from needing a permit to be consistent with the time period that the fire marshal's permit is good for.
Okay. Any questions before we go to the public hearing? Okay. Megan, is there anyone for the public hearing on this?
I don't see anyone, Andy.
Again, no one. We should be doing more of the short-term rentals. And
Can I ask
this at the same time?
hey,
Jennifer?
Andy? I have a question that I don't know if it's related to this, but I had a question about heating outdoor tents, particularly in the winter. Is that allowed, or is that, I don't know if it's relevant to this, but I just had a question about how we can keep these warm and if it's possible to heat.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think that that's the reality of how a lot of these will need to be supported if they're being used especially in the coldest part of the winter. My gut is to say that that would be regulated by the fire marshal, but I don't know if Scott or David want to weigh in on that.
No, I was going to say that it doesn't pertain to the zoning at all. It would be part of the fire marshal. And kind of one of the principal issues the fire marshal is going to look at is combustible materials and the ability of people to be able to safely evacuate. But you see tents like this set up. I think principally Loonings will do this on a busy weekend, and they have those heaters that are set up inside of them.
Okay, great.
Oh, I might have missed it. You probably said, but is this in all districts or just certain districts?
It is in all districts of the city.
Okay. Alex?
I'm just wondering, is there any kind of a permit required for these structures?
Yeah, the wording exempts it from zoning contingent on fire marshal approval, and that's for 180 days.
I mean, I have been asked on Church Street for money to buy propane to heat somebody's tent. People do live in tents in the winter. And the other, just wanted to mention that it was probably a year or so ago, the city of San Jose made some news for having astronomically high rents, and somebody was renting a tent platform in their backyard for a certain amount of money per night, like on Airbnb or something. So just imagine people making use of this, renting out tent space.
That's a good point. So this actually explicitly says that if the tents are being used for non-residential purposes. So the intent really is to address those situations where tents are being set up as an outdoor classroom or an outdoor dining room.
Or boat parking.
We already exempt tents that are used for, our ordinance says tents that are used for recreational camping purposes. That's already exempted in our ordinance from needing a permit. And that's, I'm sure, probably just targeted at things like the campground or other facilities in the city, but it's not really intended to be a housing solution. It's really intended to be more of a public facility and kind of activity solution.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Any more questions or comments? Is there a motion to forward this to the city council with the recommendation of approval and the report along with it?
I would move to forward this plan to the city council with the associated report.
And the recommendation of approval?
I would also go so far as to recommend that it be approved.
Good. So a motion by Alex, seconded by
Second.
Jennifer. Good.
I'm good at seconding tonight.
You are. Any more discussion? We always need our seconders. Okay. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Good. That also passes. Then we're on to item 7, which is our joint institutional parking management plan for 2020 to 2025.
Andy, do we want to do the 7A, which was the reapproval of the municipal bylaw amendment report?
Sure.
Okay. So I think I sent everybody an updated version of this report. I'm also happy to pull it up on the screen if it would be helpful. The City Council Ordinance Committee met a few weeks ago to talk about a number of zoning amendments that had been forwarded by the Planning Commission several months ago. One of them being the amendment to allow for greater lot coverage for convalescent homes, as well as to change the parking requirement for those facilities from 2 spaces per, was it 2 spaces per bed? To realign the parking requirement to be consistent with hospitals, essentially, which would increase the minimum parking requirement for these facilities. We had a lot of discussion about this. I know that the Planning Commission's Ordinance Committee considered a number of recommendations along with Scott about how we could potentially address the challenges that were unique to the Birchwood site, but also the information that they had shared about the staffing and resource constraints of these types of facilities that could be applicable to other facilities in the city. Ultimately, we forwarded that recommendation to address both the lot coverage limit and the minimum parking limits to the City Council Ordinance Committee. In their discussion, the City Council Ordinance Committee agreed with the change to align the lot coverage bonuses for inclusionary zoning and senior housing, so that senior housing could be eligible for the same increase in lot coverage that inclusionary housing is eligible for. But they did not agree with the change to the minimum parking requirements for convalescent homes. And their particular concerns were that this would apply citywide. They were concerned that this would be increasing the parking requirements essentially for all these facilities, and the other facilities in the city may not be experiencing the same challenges that Birchwood was experiencing. But I think they also shared a sentiment that many of the planning commissioners had expressed, which was that this felt like it was not consistent with the work that we had just done in the parking reform effort, especially given the location of this facility. So they have moved this amendment forward to the City Council for public hearing and adoption with only the lot coverage limit piece of it intact. They have rejected the change to the minimum parking requirement. So as we've done in the past, when the City Council makes a change to an amendment that you have previously forwarded to them, you are offered an opportunity to see the changes that they've made, to comment if you would like. It's not required, but if you would like, you are able to provide them comments. But from a statutory perspective, we do need to have the Planning Commission reapprove the municipal bylaw amendment report that we're getting so good at approving, and forward it back to them for their public hearing. So that's why we added this item to your agenda tonight.
Comments, Alex?
So, Megan, I appreciate that summation of what the city council did, and I think I understand their logic, but the whole reason Birchwood came to us in the first place was because they didn't have enough parking, right? So what have we fixed here through 3+ meetings?
Well, ultimately what the city council's ordinance committee said was their preference was to see Birchwood go to the DRB and try to obtain a waiver from the maximum parking limit, which was an option to them to pursue anyway. So the council was not interested in entertaining a policy change that would impact all facilities in all districts, but rather wanted them to pursue that kind of specific case route instead.
Thank you. Scott, how likely are they to get that from the DRB?
Well, I would say they're, how likely? More likely than not. You know, as Megan pointed out, there's still this discretionary option to go to the DRB. They obtained one already, and their limit wasn't the parking waiver, it was the coverage limit. And so the coverage limit has been increased to be consistent with inclusionary. So I would be willing to bet that they could get a few more parking spaces under that same DRB application.
Okay.
Okay. Alex, any other questions?
Wondering how, you know, like I understand. I mean, at the time that we moved on this, we said, well, we should really stop making these case-by-case changes, but we did it anyways.
Is the heart of this issue that there used to be enough parking because the street used to have availability for on-street parking, and then they changed it to be restricted for resident only, and now it's created this parking crisis?
That was a significant piece, Emily, is my understanding.
I think the other piece that we heard really clearly though too is just about how their staffing levels have changed. That was also a big driver, and that was, I think, the piece that was applicable to these facilities citywide, which was compelling in terms of changing the actual parking standard.
And that's regulated by the state. So they have to have minimum staffing requirements. So I think my recollection of this is when we were talking about it was that because of those minimum requirements from the state in terms of staffing levels, that it didn't make sense to do this on a case-by-case thing, but to look at a policy change, assuming that other facilities would have similar challenges with meeting parking requirements for required numbers of staff on site.
It just seems unfortunate that we're going to increase the lot coverage and increase the amount of surface parking when the streets are empty. When you drive by there's no parking on the streets. And it seems like this is actually a more nuanced issue with DPW and the neighborhood, because those streets are a public right of way. And Birchwood has, in my opinion, has as much claim to that shared parking as the neighborhood does. So to be paving over more green space seems counterproductive.
It's not going to be getting any warmer.
Yeah, and I think that the council ordinance committee members shared the sentiment that there are other solutions that could be utilized to address the parking demands, and a similar concern about increasing lot coverage and surface parking. I think that was a lot of the reason why they felt like this change wasn't, a change to increase the minimum parking required for this use wasn't consistent with some of the work that we had done on the parking reform effort.
Right, we're eliminating the parking requirements in some parts of the city, and here we're actually increasing it. You know, is pretty counterintuitive.
So my take on this is, you know, the council is of a mind that they could get their waiver. If they could get the waiver, then they'll be okay with it. And if they can't, this issue will probably come back. So, you know, I'm fine going along with it, but Scott and Megan, let us know if they do have problems getting the waiver. And, you know, that's why we were doing this, because it seemed like that could be problematic.
Okay.
That's my take. I don't know where the other commissioners are on it, but that would be my take at this point.
Yeah, it seems like a practical way to move forward. But I do think that we get to communicate back to them. I'm wondering if we want to say something about the on-street parking concerns that we have. That is this an opportunity for us to communicate some of those concerns? Because I share the same concerns that Emily has about the fact that we're not utilizing on-street parking that's fully available.
So is the on-street parking there pretty empty now because of the permit? Then I think this is a really good opportunity. We've brought this issue up a few times where it seems like the on-street parking permit requirements are missing the boat in some cases, where like here, it's not being used to provide parking for the residents. It's being used to prevent other people from parking on the street. If, you know, I think we've been pretty clear as a commission that when people have enough parking, you know, off-street parking, that you don't need to get on-street, you know, only resident parking. For all the reasons that you were just saying, this is just another example of it. So this probably is a good time to raise that again and say, here's an example of what we've been talking about in the past.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Andy.
Someone want to make a motion, maybe along those lines, or however else you want to frame it? So I think one of the things we have to do is we have to approve the report, reapprove the report, and then we could provide comments along with it. So
I move that we approve the report that's come back to us from the City Council and provide comments regarding the on-street parking and the desire to see that allowed as parking available to the facility.
So do you
where
want
there's
staff
empty
to
parking.
draft a memo to go to the council under the pen of the chair, articulating those particular concerns? Is that how you want to
Sounds
approach
good to me. Unless you've
That's
got
fine. I mean-
another way to do it.
I would suggest a strongly worded, policy-rich, you know, recommendation to the council.
Lots of superlatives?
Yes.
Just that you know, it's about the policy.
Right. So we can draft something for you to look at, Andy, and
Okay. Sounds good. I'm not sure if there was a second, Emily or Alex.
I can second. Sure.
Okay. You're frozen, Emily, but I think that was you. So Emily just seconded it. Any more discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motions, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Good. Okay, that was unanimous. Now we're on to item 7, the Joint Institutional Parking Management Plan for 2020 to 2025.
Okay, so we have Sandy Tebow, Kim Furtado, and Jonathan Dowds, who are here from CATMA and the UVM Transportation Research Center, who are going to present this item to you tonight and update you on what's been happening since the last time you heard anything about the JIP. So Sandy and Kim and Jonathan, if you want to share your screen, I think you should be able to.
Yeah, I'll just start. Good evening. It's nice to see everyone and hope everyone is doing well. I'm Sandy Tebow, Executive Director at CATMA. And as Megan mentioned, Kim Furtado, CATMA's analyst, is with us tonight, and John Dowds at the UVM Transportation Research Center. I just thought I'd provide a very quick background. I know all of you on this call are very familiar with this report, but I just kind of wanted to recap some background. So we presented a couple reiterations of the JIP in spring 2019. And in that process, it became clear that we just needed to pause. We needed to assess our data collection and the report itself. And keep in mind, this report was, this 5-year report was instituted in 2009. So when we brought the document in-house last spring, I recognized upon conversations that it really just needed an overhaul. So in the summer of 2019, CATMA partnered with the UVM Transportation Research Center. We engaged them in updating our survey instrument and methodology for our employee and student transportation surveys, and also received their expertise in research and best practices on calculating parking demands. John, here with us today, and the TRC staff worked with CATMA and the institutions over the past year. We've had numerous discussions on the data sources for parking demands, and John did a great job in the TRC in providing all that detail and information in Appendix B of the report. And John will explain a little bit more in just a minute.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I could not find the report. I wasn't in the on the agenda or online, and it seemed like what was included in our packet was just a summary. Where can I find a link to the, it's like 74-page document?
So the updated report and the appendix that Sandy was talking about were both included in the agenda packet. It's significantly shorter than it used to be, which may have been why you thought it was a summary. But I think it's a little bit less than 50 pages, and I think the supplement is about 20.
So I went to the agenda packet, and okay, I see it. Thank you.
Okay.
It is significantly shorter. So CATMA hired Kim Furtado in early December 2019, and one of her first projects, lucky her, was to conduct a thorough assessment of the JIP, and she was charged with overhauling it, a fresh look, looking at the report content, the flow, the data, the analysis, and here we are today with what I believe is a very succinct document, and I think you would agree she did a great job. Thank you, Kim. I'm also grateful for the time that the city staff spent with our team over the past year discussing this document, areas that we could improve it. I know Megan covered a lot of this in her recent memo to you. And then the recommendations that were provided last spring from city staff and planning commission have been addressed in this update that you're looking at today. Of course, here we are, as the report was nearing completion in March 2020, we entered a global pandemic, which clearly impacts, the parking demands, including the subleasing of UVM's new Pine Street lot, which, again, there's a memo with a recalculated parking demand in the packet, in your packet. We certainly anticipate an increase in telehealth, telework, and remote learning. And when we provide our spring update of the JIP, we'll see those numbers updated, and it'll be really interesting to see where all those three options are in the spring and how they impact the future parking demand. So I had hoped that you had an opportunity to read the report and found some substantial improvements and easier to digest. The good news, Emily, is I think it's a much easier read. I think, it's a 30-minute read versus maybe what it's been in the past. So I hope, I'd welcome any feedback, at the end of this conversation or any time. But we're pretty pleased with the results. And I think that the JIP can serve as a template for other employers or developers' future reports, that we've really consolidated it, and that it could be used as a template for others. So I guess with that, any questions before we run through the presentation?
Anyone
think
have
we
any
have about-
questions? Good. Good. Thanks.
I think we have about 15 minutes, I understand, for this item. And I think we can move through it pretty quickly. Kim and John are going to share information on data and the methodology and best practices, which I think is really important to understand. And then the remainder of the presentation really brings up each institution's current and future parking demands, which is all included in your report. So I think when we get to that point, I can, we can display it. And if there's any questions, I can answer it. I can run through the tables, I guess, depending, on time as well. So we have a new format. We updated our survey and lot count procedures, which Kim is going to share with you in a minute. And then the new parking demand estimate formula, which John will share. And then, as I mentioned, then we embarked upon COVID and the impacts, and we have some of that is alluded to in the report, but we'll have better numbers in our spring 21 update. So I thought I would turn it over to John and talk about the 2 data points that we utilized, which you're familiar with, for our parking demand estimates in this iteration.
Thanks, Sandy. So I'm Jonathan Dowds. I'm a researcher at the UVM TRC. The Transportation Research Center studies transportation sustainability broadly interpreted. So from the technical side of that, I've done some electric vehicle work with Jen at different points in times through very much the behavioral side of that. And on the behavioral side, we do a lot of survey research, whether that's collecting our own survey data or analyzing national sources like the National Household Travel Survey that the FHWA does each year. And so we had an opportunity to assist CATMA with developing some of the survey that went into this report and some of the methodology for it. I'm going to talk very briefly about a review that I did of some parking estimation strategies that are commonly used, and basically it comes down to a user survey approach and a lot count approach. Both methods have pluses and minuses, as you'd expect. For lot counts, which is literally sending somebody into the parking lot, counting the number of vehicles that are there and the number of empty spaces that are there, they're relatively low cost, they're easy to conduct, and if the parking lot is not close to its capacity, they're fairly effective for calculating a true demand. They don't capture what's going on the surrounding streets. They don't capture on-street parking. They don't capture latent demand. And if you're only doing these, for a day or two, which many universities do as the basis for their parking plans, you really have a small sample size problem, and you miss things like seasonal variability, which of course is very important in Vermont. If you're doing a count in the fall, you'll probably have many more people walking and biking than if you're doing it in February. If you think about all these reasons, they tend to have a tendency to provide a lower estimate of parking demand than the user survey method, which I'll go through in a moment. But they are a very common baseline method used by many higher education institutions when doing parking planning. User surveys, which is what CATMA has done for years, and we assisted with replicating this year, sends out a survey to all of the university faculty, staff, and students, as well as to staff at the hospital. And they're effective, in this case, at capturing the full demand picture. So that includes people who are parking on street, and you can gather information about latent demand, people who would park under slightly different circumstances. It's easy to track different user groups. So if a given auto user is a faculty member, a staff member, or a student, which can be good for survey weighting purposes, which helps make sure that your data is more representative. And you can get additional information about people's mode choices, about why they choose to drive, why they choose to use transit, or things like that. Of course, there are drawbacks to this methodology as well. As we set it up in the CATMA survey, it does not capture day-to-day variations in demand related to illness or travel, etc. So we ask people what their most common mode is, and then say, what are the highest number of auto users on campus? What is that number of users, and how does it compare to the number of parking spaces? So since we're asking about people's typical mode or their main mode, it doesn't account for the fact that on any given day, some percentage of people might be traveling for work, might be sick, might not be coming into work. So there's some minor variability there that's lost. And as a result, it has a tendency to provide a higher estimate of parking demand than you would get from the physical lot counts. So looking at this and talking with Sandy and Kim, our conclusion is that these are really complementary methods, and that if we provide both the survey-based estimate and lot counts, not only as sort of a one-off, here's our parking plan, but CATMA and its member institutions have collaborated to create an ongoing count structure so that you get a larger sample size, you capture that seasonal variability. These will really bound what you're looking at for peak parking demand, and provide the city and other interested stakeholders with the most complete possible picture of what the parking demand is for the member institutions. So Kim was the one who got to work through all of the actual nuances of analyzing the survey, but we provided assistance and guidance on some techniques, on the weighting, on the methodology for that. I think she'll walk through all of that, but I'm here to provide support on answering any questions that might come up during this meeting tonight.
Awesome. I will just walk through some of the changes that we made to our data collection methods and the analysis. And then if you have any questions about any of it, let me know. So looking first at the survey instrument, we worked with the TRC to make sure that we included some really key questions that were left out of our previous survey. This is asking people what their primary mode choice is, and also what times they are on campus. And those two questions are crucial to our demand formula that I'll walk through in a second. Also, for the first time, we got some interesting data on street parking and what streets people park on, which still needs some refinement to be as useful as possible in the future, but is getting us even closer to really understanding who is parking where on the city streets and who's parking on campus lots. Let's see, we weighted the survey data, as John said, and what this does is it allows us to take our pretty good sample size, I would like to say, and make it as closely representative to the actual populations of the institutions as possible. This will help account for any bias we might have in our survey response. So like if, say, the only people who answered it are people who bike to campus, that's not going to give us the most clear picture. So by weighting with parking permits, we can get more realistic data about what everyone who uses different modes are doing. And then let's see, next I'll talk quickly about the change in lot count procedure. So traditionally, or in the past I should say, CATMA's institutions, conducted counts yearly for the JIP, and we have standardized the procedure so that all of the institutions are conducting the lot counts on the same day and same time as each other, which will help account for any seasonal variability and things that might be happening because of a weather event. We also will conduct them quarterly, so October, February, April, and July, and having this much data will help us look at these trends even more than we are currently to see how they inform patterns over time, and we can rely on them a bit more heavily than we are now, because right now we only have a few days in time. And so the longer we do this, the more data we will have. We will also be counting satellite lots, which in the document in front of you, those are just an average from collected at different times. They weren't part of the standard procedure, but next week when the institutions do their counts again, they will also be counting those satellite lots, which is super important for the medical center. And then last thing for me is I'm just going to briefly go through the demand estimate formula, which is slightly different than before also. So in the past, the demand formula had been calculated by asking everyone what time they are on campus, regardless of the mode that they took to get to campus. And in this formula, it is peak time for those who drove or carpooled to campus. This just helps account for, say, like everyone, like most people on campus are at 11 a.m., but actually people drive the most at 2 p.m. This would account for any variability there. So we do that by just taking people who drive alone, or half of those people who carpool, because one vehicle, divided by everyone in the survey who responded. And that's going to give you your peak parking demand, or S percentage, I should say, and then you multiply that by the amount of users, and you'll get that actual parking space demand that you see in the JIP. And then also for on-campus students, we did it a bit differently because students store their vehicles on on-campus lots. So instead of asking what time they're on campus, because their vehicle could still be there even if they're not, hopefully they're walking and biking and all the fun stuff we like to see around town. But so they are 100% of students with vehicles divided by all the students possible on campus and then times the actual group to get that demand. And then in the document, you will also see estimates for groups that are not surveyed. So those estimates are provided directly from the institutions, and those are things like fleet vehicles, patients at the medical center, and then visitors for both of the educational campuses. So if you have any questions about that, let me know, but that's gonna be it for me, and we can look at the fun stuff. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Kim and John. I want to just make a few points. In sort of the first slide here, we showed the report itself, and this round we created a new supplement piece. So that helped to consolidate the document, and the supplement actually serves as a tool for the institutions to update their annual data so we have more consistency. So I wanted to just call that out, that the report, the data and the supplement is reflected in the report. So anyone who wants to dig into data should take a look at the supplement. I also wanted to point out the new parking utilization map that you just saw here. I think is an awesome, excellent new visual of parking utilization. It has the big picture utilization of the campuses. So that is a nice addition that Kim brought into this report. In regards to the patients and visitors, I have had discussions with the medical center, and we are exploring how we can collect better data from patients on how they are commuting or transporting to their appointments. So we'll work on that, over the next year and future years. So I don't know, in essence of time, how much you want me to go through all of these. I'm happy to maybe display them and answer any questions, but the next slides are, here's the executive summary of Champlain, UVM, and the medical center. It demonstrates their current conditions and their future conditions. And then the following slides go into each of the institutions. So Megan, I look to your advice on how you like me to proceed or thoughts.
What would folks like to do on this one? Thank you for that. Let me just check in with the commission. What would folks like to do? Do you want to just a summary of it all, or would you like the detail in the report? I don't hear anything else. Is a summary okay?
It's fine with me. I was gonna say a summary is good, and we can look more carefully at the report.
Okay. How's that sound, Sandy?
Yeah, so that's great. So here is, here's the executive summary. And I think what you probably might want to look at scrolling forward is actually, I guess back up, sorry. The collective strategy. I know this was a recommendation that we received from city staff that they would like us to do, highlight more of the collective strategies among the institutions. So we did create a whole new chapter in the report on that. I think we were doing a lot of collective strategies and not necessarily pointing them out or highlighting them in the report. So here's just a brief list of some of the collective collaboration that we have among the institutions. And then we'll scroll ahead. So Champlain College, I think, probably the takeaway from this current conditions is the net spaces, sort of the bottom line. So we have the number of potential users and the peak parking demand with visitors and fleet. And so you can see that the current conditions, although this is going to be different than where we are today and where we're going to be in the spring, because with telework and more learning remotely. But here we see Champlain with an excess of 98 spaces. There's some information here on the transportation modes that's also in the report. And I think the drive alone for Champlain College, broken out by employees in the yellow line, students within a half mile and outside a half mile of campus. So, it's continues to have a downward trend for driving alone. These are their future conditions. Over the next 5 years, by 2025, I mean, this is what they expect based on the projected user groups and the parking supply. We added in a new line of estimated TDM effects. For Champlain College, it will be the e-bikes and updating their permit policies, exploring updating their parking permit policies. And here for the future in 2025, they estimate a 94 space surplus. And you'll see the current conditions, the parking supply in their future is 50 less than the current. And that is as they plan to reduce their lease at the 115 Lakeside lot by 50 spaces. Here's some of the projects. These are in the report as well, planned, nothing through until 2025. And just highlighting some of Champlain College's TDM strategies, which are similar for the institutions. They are currently, with COVID, they are paying per use versus the traditional permit structure for now. And then they've also implemented a new shuttle schedule for Lakeside and 194 St. Paul up to the main campus, again, with limited capacity on the shuttles. They've had to institute additional shuttles. And then the same moving forward for the UVM and the medical center. So here for the University of Vermont, based on the current conditions. Now, keep in mind, this is current as in pre-COVID. I think that's important to keep in mind. I think we all know that's going to change. And their parking supply and net spaces at 185. As noted in the green box here on this slide, the difference in the supply from the previous iteration of the JIP is that UVM has leased a new lot on Pine Street that has 200 spaces. It is sort of behind, there's green, used to be a transit building. And I think dealer.com leases some spaces behind there. And then there is additional space behind there. So the university did lease that lot. This is again the summer or pre-COVID. So so with those 200 spaces added to their parking supply, as was recommended in the last iteration from city staff, and they're at 185 net spaces. And again, we have some mode data in this pie chart and drive alone trend, which we do see for employees and students outside of half mile is creeping up a little bit. And I know we've talked in the past, you know, the effect of more affordable housing outside of Chittenden County, where maybe transit isn't available, so people do have to drive more, could affect that, as well as gas prices.
Can I ask some questions about that last slide?
Yep.
Or maybe it's, I'm looking at this, the previous TDM report that we received last year that I don't think got forwarded on to council, but it's actually the future conditions. So maybe it's the next slide I'm actually interested in. So.
Yeah. So here's the future conditions for the University of Vermont. Just noting here, the parking supply, you can see in the project list on the right, the last row has the Colchester Research Facility, where they will gain 200 spaces. That will be added to, that's added to their parking supply in this future condition chart. We also have estimated TDM effects that are the eventually here, the electric assist bikes that will be on our ground potentially in the next year. And they've added some motor drive cycle spaces and non-vehicle spaces. And then they have a permit initiative where people can, employees can, if they give up their permit, they receive an incentive. So those are 3 of the TDM effects, estimating 77 spaces. So in 5 years, the net space surplus for UVM is 277.
So when we looked at this in the past, it was broken down: residential students, long-term vehicle storage, commuters outside of half a mile of campus, commuters within half a mile of campus. But it looks like the user group is now grouped together just off campus and on campus. Is that data in the full report about the, I can see it in the chart on the previous slide where you show the commuters that are traveling from less than a half a mile to campus. And that seems like very different than the data that we looked at last time.
Kim, do you have that data point?
So the demand estimate has changed, so we've simplified it so that we no longer need to break it down in the demand formula by off-campus students outside of half mile and inside of half mile, because that peak parking demand will account for both of them. As for the difference in the numbers, you can see the drive alone percentage for like the trends on this previous slide here. Will show that there's that difference between the two, but we've just lumped them together so it works out the same, if that makes sense. The difference in percentage, do you have the old, I don't have the old report, so I don't know what that is.
Commuters outside of half a mile of campus was 43. It's hard for me to see this here. Auto ownership mode share.
Mm-hmm.
And
okay, and then I guess I should add another difference in these numbers is that previous calculation did not account for those who drove at different times. So that'd be like, I believe, sorry, I didn't do the math for that one, so I'm not as expert as I am on this current one, but that would be anyone who like drove to campus at any time from off campus, whereas now this number is much lower, the percentage, because it's just those driving at that peak time, instead of multiplying the peak time percentage by those who drive alone. So you have 1% instead of 2 on the, as you see on the older charts.
Emily,
Yeah,
is your
I'm
question-
just, I guess I don't understand how the data is so different, because on the previous data it showed commuters within half a mile of campus was 640 demand. And I'm showing here off-campus students is 1,261. And I don't know how many of those students are traveling from within a half a mile and traveling from, like, how many of those, what I'm interested in, what I want to know is how many students live in downtown Burlington
And okay, so you
and
won't be
are
able to
taking
see
cars
that
to campus.
number in the formula, because it's not that relevant to conduct like figuring out the parking demand. But as the chart that I have pulled up right now, this graph, you can see this blue line, that's students within that half mile. So living in downtown Burlington, percentage is super low. I believe it's like 2 or 3%. And it's written
In
in
the
the
previous data, it was 640 students.
Yes, and I now see what we are talking about, and I can explain that. And it is because in the previous survey, students that lived on Redstone campus and not Redstone campus, but in the Redstone Loss and the Redstone's apartments were counted as on-campus students, though they don't keep their cars on UVM parking lot. So it's inflated that percentage or that number by more than people
For
who
on
actually-
campus?
Yes.
Okay, I'm interested in off campus. I'm interested in off campus students that have cars. And I mean, I think what I'm trying to get at is the parking demand that is in the neighborhoods, like that are students that are living off campus, have cars and are using them to drive closer to campus.
Yep. And so our demand formula actually accounts for that, because it's parking demand in general. It doesn't actually specify whether you're parking on a campus lot or not. So you could be parking on the street and you would be counted as this. And that's why this number that you see here is so much higher than the actual utilization, because it's all of the demand. And this overestimates the number of people parking on campus. So if that helps.
Yeah, I think I just need more time with the report to get into it. To be frank, I feel like there's a lot of data here, and what I'm particularly interested in is, the parking burden that's off campus, that's created by UVM, that's off campus, because.
And that's I should draw your attention to the report itself. It has the number of people in the survey who responded to saying that they're parking on streets. So if that's a number that you want to see.
Yeah, and you also mentioned that you had in the survey locations. I'd be interested to have that pointed out. But anyways, yeah. I will stop asking questions and move on.
I actually have just a follow-up on that one a little bit. Kim, is there anything in the report or somewhere where what UVM might be doing to discourage students, or how it might go about to discourage students who live within a half mile or mile of campus from driving in their cars to get closer to campus?
I think, and anyone else feel free to jump in, but I think this is where that collaboration between like the UVM and the city comes in. UVM is providing their sustainable transportation options, including their shuttle and having the e-bikes. Most of the parking on the streets is typically taken up already by the time students can come during this peak time, because that's what this report looks at. I'm not aware of other things that UVM is doing. Sandy, I don't know if you have more knowledge than I do.
Yeah. So there are a couple of initiatives that they are working on. They have implemented a parking permit module in the transportation parking office. So anyone that comes in to request a permit has to complete a module, basically bringing to their attention, this is the cost, these are other options for you, to really discourage them from even purchasing the permit. And then they're also, planning to do some warehouse parking of resident students, or even off-campus students within a half mile if they need to park their car, off-site to warehouse it, to keep it out of the, main campus area. And then certainly like electric assist bikes and, you know, offsite and the shuttles.
Thanks.
And
I can
Emily?
also add something. Today, the situation is completely different, but last year, pre-COVID, we also instituted specific motorcycle parking. So instead of a motorcycle taking up a full parking space, we found subpar car parking spaces that were perfect for motorcycles. So that was another item that is geared to reducing the demand for parking.
And Emily, I would just ask, when you dive into the report and the data more, any questions that you have, please reach out to us.
Thanks. Yeah, this is a very dense report.
I can just jump in quickly. Emily, I'll just second what Sandy said. Once you've had a chance to look at it a little more closely, definitely reach out with questions, but just highlighting a couple of things which I think Kim was getting at. One is that the students who do live within half a mile do have a very low rate of driving to campus alone. So the on-street parking is coming primarily from students and students who are more than a half mile from campus and employees as well. I don't believe we broke out employees based on their distance from campus. And I also don't have the last report, so I can't speak to that 600 number. But the full report does have an estimate of the amount of on-street parking demand that is generated by UVM, because we did ask people again, you know, if you are not parking in the lot, if you're parking on a street, first indicate that you're parking on a street, and then you know, actually down to the level of what street are you parking on. And that's a little harder to tabulate in a useful way, but that's all information that CATMA is working on collecting with UVM and continuing to think about that issue.
Thanks.
So I think just so that if it sounds like we were going to follow up on this, some questions around this specific accounting for off-campus behavior. And Kim said something I think that's important that maybe you can clarify when we follow up on that, which is how the Redstone Lofts and other campus sponsored or campus affiliated housing that's not technically considered on-campus housing is accounted for in these reports, because I do think that that could impact where we're seeing some demand shifting between categories if they've been categorized differently in this report than they were in previous iterations of this report.
We can do that.
I have a question too about, so what this is showing, if I'm reading this correctly, is that there's a net positive number of spaces available even at peak times on campus. Is that?
That's correct.
So that should relieve pressure on neighborhood streets for parking, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I would comment on that. I'm not sure that it will.
Yeah, so I'm like, something's not connecting for me here. So,
well, the reason why it doesn't relieve parking in the neighborhoods is that all of the parking on UVM, there's a charge for it, rightly so, because you don't want to give, if you give away free parking, people are going to utilize it more. So there's a cost to that parking, and much of the parking that's in the neighborhoods has no cost. So I'm curious, you know, I don't think UVM is responsible for that, but there's a hole in the bucket, right? You can provide all of this parking, but if you can park for free in the neighborhoods, then you're going to park for free in the neighborhoods, and you're going to circle around in your car for 15 minutes, having some of the largest carbon impact in the city, driving your car at slow speeds, stopping and starting to find that parking spot. So I think that that's a huge gap in how we're approaching this parking issue for UVM and CATMA in general.
yeah, there's that, but there's also permit parking. So I think there's a couple of things that are sort of
Yeah.
maybe at play here. So even if it is free parking, you can't park unless you have a permit in number of streets that are in proximity to UVM. So I guess part of my question was, is the, what is the universities or the, Champlain also, I mean, it was surprising to me to see that they have 98, positive spaces, given, I think that, people generally think is very constrained parking environment there. So where my mind's going with this is, are we doing everything we can to maximize those spaces to get people off of downtown streets? Is it well advertised, or something that needs to be done to utilize those? Or are we providing too much space for parking, which I guess might sound counterintuitive given that people are parking on street, but I also think it's not the best use of land. So how's cars? So like, is there, is too much parking being provided? And I don't know that is the answer is yes, but if there's at peak times a significant number of spots that aren't being utilized, what's going on there?
So I will, so some feedback on that is UVM did conduct a transportation parking study with a consultant in May 2019. And it is moving up to leadership, which was, stalled a bit upon COVID. But I can tell you broadly that in that study, there are some recommendations for them to evaluate their permit structure, I think to Emily's point, and that the consultant is recommending that they do more incentivizing for sustainable transportation. And they also are recommending that they explore improving technologies for accountability. So there are some recommendations in that report that, have yet to make it up to upper leadership at the moment. But those are some of the recommendations. And I also strongly believe, when we come out of this pandemic, whenever that may be, or even during, I think we are going to see more people working from home, whether it's 3 days a week or 2 days a week, and so there's an opportunity, I think, to look at schedules among the institutions as well, for parking and traffic demand, from telehealth to more students working remotely. Learning remotely. So I think with everything that is happening right now, and the recommendations and discussions happening within the institutions to discourage people driving alone, when we provide the spring update, I expect there'll be some new information and data there.
Yep. And I have to keep reminding myself that this is about parking, because I do think that our goals really are to get people to not drive alone, right? We want to reduce the impact of transportation to the university, and parking is one way of looking at it, but maybe thinking about how this is reported in terms of greenhouse gas emissions or some other impacts to the community might be also something to think about in the future. So just a thought, food for thought.
Yeah.
If I can follow up with 2 quick points on this table showing the net surplus of 185 spaces. Kim, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the parking demand, the peak parking demand, 4,754, is inclusive of people who are currently parking on the street. So what that 185 number says is, if you were able to induce everyone who's parking on the street in the peak period to park on campus, there would still be a small surplus of spaces. But that does go, Emily, very much to your point about the pricing, and Jen, to your point about the permitting. So there are issues there.
Yeah.
And then thinking about, Jen, is this too much parking? A surplus of 185 out of 4,900 spaces only means there's about 5% of spaces open. Generally, this is considered effectively filled just because, you know, people park over the line sometimes, so then one car is taking up 2 spaces. Something's being restriped and there's a cone in a couple of spaces. And at a certain point, people just won't look for those spaces. So 185 is a large number of parking spaces if they're all right next to each other. It's a pretty small number if they're scattered across a bunch of lots that total close to 5,000 spaces. So we're not talking about fields and fields of open parking spaces here, even though it would be a lot.
I was thinking 185 all next to each other is a lot of space, but I get your point.
There may be, it may be that there's 185 spaces, but the lot that you want to park at, because it's the closest to Williams Hall, because that's where your class is full. And you go there and it's full, and then you drive around and go somewhere else. And so some way of knowing where there's availability would be helpful. But I wanted to ask about COVID. You know, we've talked a lot about the ability for people to work from home, but do you think that there's also going to be an impact of fewer people wanting to take public transportation because they don't feel safe being on shared buses, or fewer people wanting to carpool together because they don't feel safe sharing a car with someone or with a group of people in an enclosed space?
I think that's a good question. One that the transit company and van pool companies and have been discussing. I think Green Mountain Transit has done a great job providing the safety protocol and PPE that riders need. And it is my understanding that they are at about 75% capacity, I believe, right now. And then one transportation option that's been getting popular in our industry in the country is van pooling, where you have a group of people that maybe have their little pod, or they trust each other and they work in a similar, you know, geographic business district that might be interested in van pooling. And the state has just announced that they're increasing their van pool subsidy pretty a lot. And so it's something that we are exploring with the hospital right now is, you know, this potential van pool, but it's going to have to be with people that feel comfortable and safe, and there's protocol. So I think the industry, you know, as a whole, the transit industry is working on that.
Yeah, and then I'd just like to add a piece of data that maybe will give you some security of mind is that this summer, in collaboration with the Association for Commuter Transportation, CATMA, helped push out a survey. And we got the results for the people in Vermont who filled it out. And I know a big fear of mine was that we would see the drive alone rate skyrocket because of COVID, but we see that is projected in the survey, it's one survey, but to stay pretty much the same. You do see a decrease in both bus ridership and carpooling, but that decrease in that was offset by the huge, it was like 70% increase in teleworking and then like a 30% increase in bike riding. So hopefully those projections hold true, and I think we'll at CATMA do everything we can to keep pushing those modes, and all the other transportation partners are doing their part too. So
I recognize I always seem to go way over my time, but we just, you know, you're working with 3 gigantic, large institutions, and we have a lot of data. So I apologize for taking more time. I don't know if you want to continue here. I think we've covered, I covered the strategies. And the medical center, their current conditions, they have no planned projects in the next 5 years, so their net spaces are 179 currently, and then there's no change in the future conditions. There's no future plans for them. So,
Sandy, could you explain to the Planning Commission why that net spaces looks so much different than the last report they saw?
Kim?
Sorry, Kim.
Yeah,
Yes.
There's several, several explanations.
So the biggest is that, so a little backstory, we went back and forth with this, so your feedback would be welcome. But so, and I believe in the last report, the supply that you saw included the satellite lots that the medical center relies heavily on to handle their on-campus parking demand. So we went back and forth on whether this demand should include those spaces and those people who use them or not. So we did it both times. What you're seeing in front of you is just the on-campus lots, including those leased by UVM. Anyone who's driving onto the Hill campuses, that's that number. The people who go and park in a satellite lot and then shuttle onto that campus, they are not included in the peak parking demand percentage, nor are those spaces counted in the supply. The reason we ended up going this route was because if you include the satellite lots, you have the surplus that is rather large, which kind of goes against our preconceptions of what the medical center looks like. So we didn't want to like present like a 500 place space surplus, and you all, if you have been there, you know that there's not 500 spaces available for you to park in anytime you go to the medical center. So this part of the data just seemed most relevant to what you all were looking for. But yeah,
Well,
this.
Kim, it would seem to me that if you are, thank you for that explanation, but if you're just looking at visitors, then that makes sense. But if you're including particularly employees that are, you know, the plurality of who's going there, that's where a lot of them, I would imagine, park. And so I think you need to account for it somehow, whether putting it in the total parking supply and then, you know, the net spaces, or having a separate line to talk about that. But I think just leaving it out, if it is left out, it may be in another area of the report, but just leaving it out leaves it, I think leaves it with a misunderstanding of what the parking is. We've spent, you know, the last number of years really focused a lot on the satellite parking. And, you know, I mean, you could imagine, or I could imagine, the medical center coming with a report like this and saying, you know, we have all this supply that we need. We only have an extra 179 spaces. We need more spaces, you know, at our facility.
Yeah, and so
I do think it's important to, you know, whether it's in this section or in some other way, to recognize the satellite parking.
Yeah, and so in future versions we can quickly add that because like we have all the data needed to do that. So thank you for that. And then also for some peace of mind, we do include the counts for the satellite lots in the supplement, I believe, and that will show you that there's like about an 80% utilization in all of those. So you know that for this current version, and then we can continue to look at that.
Great, thanks.
That works.
I agree with Andy that I think it's important to, if there is truly a 500 parking space surplus because of these satellite lots, it doesn't, like I can understand why it doesn't make sense to include it now because it doesn't make sense to what we experience on the ground. But it's very interesting that we have that kind of capacity because there's so much parking that's happening locally within a half mile of campus that really is long-term car storage. You know, so if we know about that, I think it could maybe direct policy outside of us and, you know, looking at DPW and on-street parking to really manage our parking supply as the city as a whole, because there's so many students, I think, who are coming to live in Burlington, want to have a car, are parking it for free within a block of campus and letting it sit there, and it's taking up a very valuable parking spot, where that parking that is long-term, like I need to be able to go home for the weekend, I need to be able to go home for vacations, I go skiing twice a month, that could be utilized in an off-campus parking lot in those extra 500 spaces.
I should clarify, those extra 500 spaces that the medical experience is experiencing, that's not long-term parking, that's daily people going to work. So it's different. And similarly to with UVM, what we just saw, it's a surplus out of a lot of spaces. So it's not like they have this huge percentage of open spaces. They have a very well utilized and managed parking lot, if that makes sense.
The addition of lot counts, as Kim had mentioned earlier, I think is going to be really valuable moving forward. We will have quarterly lot counts for this year, which got a little bit interrupted here with COVID. But I think in moving over the years ahead, we're going to have quarterly lot counts that will show the trends, and then we can look at how those lot counts, you know, and the survey data align up. So that will be a new data point that I think will be information.
Sandy, I think that one of the things that I'm hearing as kind of an undercurrent to some of these questions and discussion is just about having available spaces really depends on who those spaces are offered to ultimately. And I don't know if there's any information that you have. I really do appreciate the lot count map, because I think that it shows what Jonathan was saying, which is that many of the lots that are utilized by all of the institutions are effectively full. But I'm curious if we know of the available, or of those lots, the ones that have the greatest levels of utilization, are they ones that are kind of pay to park lots, or are those lots that you need a permit to park in? Because I think that that could be informative in understanding where that open capacity exists within the institution systems.
Yeah, and my assumption would be that they're pay to park.
Where the available spaces are, or where the highest capacity is?
Where the highest capacity is.
Yeah, yeah, that would be my assumption as well.
Yeah. Yeah, those are good questions. Additions.
Is there anything else, or this has been a great report, great summary. I know it took you a little bit longer, but that's actually appreciated. Don't think twice about that. This is something that's really important. So any other questions from the commission?
Do I have a couple, just last slide, I think.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess, you know, moving forward, we have created a guide internally at CATMA on this report, the process, who we receive data from, when we have to get data, the analysis, so that there will be consistency, a consistent procedure moving forward. So that's going to be very helpful for CATMA, and I think for the city and the institutions on the JIP process procedure. We do plan to conduct an employee and student transportation survey in the spring. It doesn't seem to make sense to conduct a survey next month. Students are going to be heading home before Thanksgiving. So unfortunately, again, I guess a hiccup that we'll wait to the spring to have that survey data. And ideally, you know, we want to have the analysis of that survey to put in our spring update, depending what spring semester looks like. We have our lot counts scheduled for October 20th through the 22nd. The 3 institutions collect data on the same date and time. And then, yeah, we have our spring update for the Planning Commission. And then I guess next steps as far as moving the JIT forward to the DRB. I'll look to Megan
Yeah, so it sounds like the Planning Commission would like some more time to take a look at the report and dig into the details a little bit more. We've identified a few things that would be helpful, either in a memo form to point us to, or maybe to clarify in the final version of the report, which I'll follow up with Sandy and Kim about. I will also draw the Planning Commission's attention to a draft memo that we put in the agenda packet. So you might remember that back in the spring, sometimes it feels like it was a lot longer than that, but back in the spring, we had been working on a draft letter of recommendation to the DRB from the Planning Commission and staff that outlined a number of items that we wanted to see. We did go through that memo and provide some information for the Planning Commission about how each of those points that we were including in that letter of recommendation were addressed. And from that, we started to formulate a draft letter based on this updated document from the Planning Commission to the DRB for you to take a look at. So we would definitely appreciate any feedback that you have on what that looks like, anything else you would want to see in it, that we can talk about when we revisit this again.
Great. I just want to thank, again, the Transportation Research Center, John here with us today, and Kim for their hard work. The institutions were really engaged in this project, and city staff, and I think we've created a much better document, easier to understand, with sounds like maybe a couple of additional data points to add. So just want to thank everybody for their time through this process.
Thank you all, and thanks for coming tonight.
Yeah.
Again, we really appreciate the time you gave to us tonight.
You're welcome.
Any last questions or comments from anyone on the commission? All right.
No, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. So we're going to move on to items 8, which are commissioner items. Our next meeting is Wednesday, October 28th at 6:45. Any other commissioner items? Okay, then we have item 9.
Now it's 9, yeah.
Minutes and communications. Is there a motion to approve the minutes and accept, and minutes as amended, I think it was, and accept communications? And I see a motion by Jennifer, thank you, and a seconded by Emily. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of that motion say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Then the next final item is adjournment.
I move that we adjourn this meeting of the Planning Commission.
Motion by Alex, seconded by Emily. All those in favor of adjournment say aye.
Aye.
We stand adjourned. Thank you all.